Hi, everybody. I am Jessamyn Shams-Lau, your host today. Welcome to It's Not Your Money, real talk about achieving racial equity in philanthropy. These slightly irreverent, frank conversations feature the leaders challenging the status quo of philanthropy today and those demonstrating how we can build a more equitable and just funding landscape. And that's particularly for Black, Indigenous, other people of color, women, and non-binary founders. Today, I have the absolute pleasure of being joined by Abdiel López, Director of Capital Activation for Justice Funders. Abdiel, welcome to the show. Please tell our audience a little bit about yourself.
Yes, thank you so much, Jessamyn. So my name is Abdiel. I am currently the Director of Capital Activation at Justice Funders. So my background is actually in arts philanthropy, and that was my introduction to solidarity economy, just transition work when I managed the Ambitious Portfolio, which is a national time-limited portfolio that invests specifically in solidarity economy efforts authored by BIPOC communities. From that point on, I became obsessed with this idea of supporting and working with movement partners and frontline communities on the ground. So I supported Rowan Horse Consulting in their Indigenous-based economic development work. And from there, I found my way here to Justice Funders as a Director of Capital Activation. So the crux of my work is really to help popularize the Just Transition Investment Framework, which I'll talk a little bit about today, and just see who else is out there, who else is interested in this kind of work. How can we activate a just transition for our frontline communities through our investment practices specifically, but also our grant-making portfolios, and yeah, just strategizing more deeply on supporting and working with frontline communities. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm based in LA, so I'm excited to be here and to chat with you.
In a real life art gallery as well, I just learned, which my little previous life artist heart is fluttering.
Yes, actually, so prior to my involvement in philanthropy, I was an art gallery manager. And that was actually, I think, another point of politicization for me when I realized how extractive the art world was for artists, specifically artists of color. So I think it all makes sense why I'm intervening in my apartment with this art gallery. So really excited to have that as my background.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Abdiel. Okay, we are going to dig into Justice Funders. We're going to dig into Just Transition very, very soon. But as people who listen regularly know, one of the things that we remind folks listening through our title and our opening question is that when we incorrectly label the money in foundations and donor advised funds as still belonging to the founders, then we also act like that money and the foundation belong to them, which isn't true, and which perpetuates the concentration of power. So our words influence who holds power. So my question for you, Abdiel, what shift in language would you like to see us can mean whatever you want, but what shift in language would you like to see that might help diversify power, particularly in the world of social change?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And part of the work that we do with the Just Transition investing specifically is we do see and understand why racial equity could be a first sort of step towards the liberation of all people. But I think what we're trying to say here, and we'll probably get to this later, is how do we move beyond the sort of reformist traditional ideas of ESG investing, for example, environmental social governance, or DEI initiatives that just focus on representation, but oftentimes lack the inclusion and liberation of people of color. So how do we start to engage in that language that allows us not just to provide a seat at the table for people of color or frontline community members, but also how do we activate the power so that they can be influential in the decisions that we make? How can we shift control? And so I think, yes, language is as important as our tangible action. So how can we tangibly and materially shift the conditions that support frontline communities in building wealth, in building their own self-determination? So I think it's a both and. Language is great to start, because I think something that I've been thinking a lot about is that which is not named does not exist, which is why we do use inclusive language, which is why we use accessible language. And I think at this point, we've had so many conversations, so many great frameworks authored by movement partners and frontline community members, that it's time for us to actually activate what's been written about, what's been about.
So true. Preaching to the choir, definitely. And I'm really hoping that our conversation today gives folks listening some steps, right? There's a wonderful framework and a lot of experience and just deep wisdom and knowledge that has been put into not only the the practical tools that Justice Funders have put together, but also just the approach that Justice Funders takes to moving through the world. And if I'm sounding like a little bit of a fangirl of Justice Funders, that's because I will fully admit, been a huge fan of Justice Funders for several years now, and it's absolutely brilliant to be able to dig into what you're doing today. And funny story, well, not really funny story, but interesting moment. I have your Just Transition for Philanthropy framework right here on my slopey wall. Yep, here to remind me. Yeah, just proving my fangirl status. But I am really excited for those who are listening, who might be unfamiliar with Justice Funders, for them to learn a little bit more about not just Justice Funders, but the Just Transition philosophy. So could you just tell us a little bit about that philosophy of the organization and just the ambitions behind the movement?
Yeah, another great question. So Justice Funders really serves to guide philanthropy in moving from an extractive to more regenerative philanthropic practice and ecosystem. So really, our work started, I believe, back in 2009 as a response to the murder of Oscar Grant in the Bay Area. A group of philanthropic foundation officers came together to start to think through ways to actually support frontline communities in the wake of the murder of Oscar Grant. And from that point on, the Bay Area Justice Funders Network membership came about. And for the next few years, they were thinking, incubating, experimenting with ways to be in alignment with frontline communities even more intentionally. It wasn't until around 2018 when we actually released the Resonance Framework, which was our first framework around moving to a more regenerative practice for philanthropy, more focused on grant making, yes. But I think that was the seed of us actually naming what we now name as the Just Transition movement, Just Transition investing. And so I think that's what also separates Justice Funders from perhaps other philanthropy serving organizations, is that we're committed, rooted, and we value the Just Transition. So we are responsive to the Just Transition movement leaders and partners. And so in tandem with the movement leaders, we basically act, like I said, as a guide and support philanthropy / foundations who want to actually act in alignment with this movement, which I can give you a definition in a bit. So essentially that's been the journey. In 2020, we actually decided, you know what, let's walk the walk. So we became a worker self-directed nonprofit organization in which we collapse any hierarchies and democratize governance. We share power and our staff. So we're even on this journey ourselves of like, how is it that we can actually become a decentralized autonomous organization and actually be the guide for philanthropy and showcase there are other ways, other models beyond the traditional, perhaps 501c3 models that they can actually start to adopt, maybe not within their own internal structure, but perhaps in their investing. Think about investing and supporting non-501c3s led by people of color, because we're realizing more and more, and this is a little tangential, but still related, that many frontline communities are experimenting with models that are outside the tradition, that are outside the norm. And because they're outside the norm, many philanthropic institutions overlook them, oversee them, and don't fund them. So we're saying, let's pay attention to those efforts in our backyards, and let's get creative with the money that we have. So that was a little tangent, so that was in 2020 when we decided to name this Just Transition movement as integral to philosophy. And for the past 2 years, 2021 through this year, we convened with a community of funders that we now call the Just Transition Investment Community,
Mhm.
who were really trying to agitate the field and, again, be more in alignment with movement partners and with the thought partnership of select movement partners on the ground, like Rowan Horse Consulting, East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, and others like Climate Justice Alliance as well, Richmond Air Power Coalition. We started to codify and, well, first found the need to codify what a just transition even looked like for philanthropy.
Right.
And specifically through investment, because what we've seen is that grant makers or foundations have only leveraged their grant making dollars. But what if they leverage other parts of their assets that could actually be reparative, regenerative for movement partners? So that was the beginning, the origin story of our Just Transition Investment Framework, which we launched just 3 months ago. And that's all rooted in this Just Transition movement, which actually I think it might help for us to just go through the definition of a just transition.
Yeah,
and
please, let's do that.
Yeah, this definition is provided by the Climate Justice Alliance. And I'm just going to read it just so it's all clear for all of us. And basically, they say that a just transition is a vision-led, unifying, and place-based set of principles, processes, and practices that build economic and political power to shift from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy. A lot of words as well that I think it's worth parsing through to really understand what extractive means and what we mean by regenerative. So extractive here in this case really means, and for what we've seen from the field, is this removal of wealth from communities through the depletion, through the degradation of, for example, natural resources, or the exploitation of human labor, even the accumulation of wealth by interests outside of the community, such as big banks, big oil, big box stores. So what we're saying is, let's dismantle that and let's move toward a practice that is based on this sort of reciprocal relationship of the interdependence between not only human communities, but also the living world that we live in. So how can we move towards that through our own philanthropic practice? So we are incubating, we are experimenting, we're coaching, we are consulting with different foundations to really enact and activate these different alternative ways of giving, and moving away also from this sort of charity-based model to a more solidarity model of giving.
And there's a couple of things that I just want to highlight from what you were just sharing there. One is that, as you said, a just transition is not something that justice funders came up with, right? This is part of a much bigger movement, right? That is being applied in lots of different ways, in lots of different areas of how, various institutions, various systems try and improve the world. But what Justice Funders is doing is taking that idea of a just transition and very specifically applying it to philanthropy, and doing so in, as you have said, Abdiel, not just talking about it. It's not just about the frameworks. Like, we're on the ground. We are doing this with people. We're in the boardrooms. We're in there with the staff. We are, you're working directly with trustees as well. And I think the other thing that I just wanted to mention as well, for anybody who's like, oh my gosh, they're talking my language right now. But they're like, but I work for a funder who would never be down with this. Like, this is so far away from where they're at right now. You also, please correct me if I'm wrong, but you also have individual members, right, who can learn alongside. I know this because I was one when I was leading a foundation in the Bay Area. And you have an amazing network there, but also newsletter that really kind of just does a great job of curating so much hope, right? If you're an individual in a foundation feeling like, I don't know if I have the power to make any change within my own organization, but I need to feed the hope that this is still happening, elsewhere. Please check out their website and see if it makes sense for you to sign up as an individual, because it's really a beautiful picture of flourishing that's happening.
Yes, and thank you for that because we also have public programming events throughout the year that you don't have to be
Mm,
a member to join. For example, the
right.
Series movement was where we shared our framework, our investment framework. But also, what I appreciate, and to your point about the curation, what I appreciate about how Justice Funders approaches this, and also I was kind of a fangirl before I came to the organization 4 months ago is that they basically map out this sort of constellation of potential through
Mm,
which foundations can join this movement. So it doesn't really matter where you are on the spectrum of
right.
extractive to regenerative, as long as the goal is if you want to move to regenerative
Moving in that
philanthropic practice,
direction.
let's plug you into this constellation and let's work with you to
Mm-hmm.
improve maybe your grant making ethos
Yeah.
or in the way you politicize your own staff, right? There are many ways that you can
Mm-hmm.
go about it. So 100% join us for the public programs and also individual memberships.
Yes, 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 yes. Okay, so now let's dive into the frameworks because that is why we're here. Is
Yes.
we want to talk about these tangible steps for philanthropy to move towards a just transition. And as you said, there is one framework that Justice Funder has created that is focused on grant making, and that's the resonance framework. And then there is another framework that is focused on the other 95% of endowments, or if you're, slightly further along, on that spectrum towards regenerative, maybe it's less than 95%, but still the bulk of the money in endowments. And that framework is the Just Transition Investing Framework. So we're specifically going to talk about that one today. If you want to check out Resonance, please go to the Justice Funders website and you can download all of that there. Okay, so a lot of people listening, I'm guessing, will be familiar with the movement towards negative screening of endowment investments, or, the push that started, let's say 10, 15 years ago now, around moving towards mission-related investments. So there are conversations that have been going in this direction that people might be familiar with. And what I'd love for you to help us understand is, how is just transition investing different from those conversations that have already kind of got established around negative screening and MRIs?
Yeah, so this is an excellent question because what we've seen so far in impact investing and MRIs is at the end of the day, the crux of it is still how can we receive profits? How can we maximize our profits? Despite the sort of screenings that are going behind the scenes, it's still at the end of the day rooted in this profitability. So what we're saying is let's even challenge the notion of receiving profits. And how can, if we do, how can we give it back to the communities that we're investing in? So this framework does a really good job of providing 4 major, I would say, quadrants to shift power and capital. And it really goes into detail on some of the common pitfalls or false solutions, as we call them, and what can we actually do. And I would say ESG investing, for example, or traditional impact investing is a false solution because on paper, it may seem like it's a great way to move toward a regenerative economy. But again, the point of that is still, how can we max our profits through these screens, right? So we're saying, no, let's eradicate that idea. How can we move in solidarity with movement partners? So there are different ways we can practice non-extractive lending, non-extractive investment practices that are in right relationship and that are still rooted and even could be authored by the very movements themselves. So we're asking through this framework, how are you in right relationships with the communities that you work with? What resources do they need and how are you providing those resources? Because honestly, philanthropy does have a huge risk tolerance, even if the field believes it doesn't, it does. So how can we actually leverage that and be that cushion for our movement partners that don't have the ability to be risky, if you will?
So, and sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No. I was just going to ask, could you give an example of what does it look like to truly implement those principles? Like, can you just give one example of what that looks like on the ground?
100%. We actually, and I have a really good example because we are also in tandem with this investing framework. We also launched a demonstration project tentatively called the Just Transition Integrated Capital Fund. And
Okay.
that is basically a pooled fund of, I believe, 15 to $20 million. We're still fundraising for that, but it's completely governed by the movement partners, some of the movement partners that I mentioned, like Rowan Horse Consulting, East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative. And I would say the not compromise, but the agreement that funders made to join this pooled fund is they give up all power. They have no say as to how the money is deployed, as to who receives the money. It's all in the governing board's exactly hands. So they get to determine how much money are we getting, what kind of capital do we need, also what other non-financial resources do we need to, for example, apply for a loan in the future, as an example. So that even just that sort of activation of that capital and of the shifting of power can start to demonstrate that there is a way and there are possibilities for philanthropy to just give up their wealth and have no say in how the capital is deployed and really listen to those who are closest to the system that has unfortunately extracted from them and are remaking the rules for the economy. So that's just one clear example. And many of these movement partners have their own loan funds and are currently fundraising. So philanthropy professionals can reach out to them and see how can we be of service to you through our investments or grant making. And also, I would say something that's been really valuable and a really good learning right now is that movement partners right now especially need runway capital. So I think oftentimes we still even attach strings to the grant making dollars. What we're saying is completely unfetter that. People literally just need money to survive, especially in this economy. Let's provide runway. Let's think with our community members about what else, what kind of loans do they need? What kind of, again, technical assistance or mentorship do they need? And so this demonstration project hopefully will activate some of that and hopefully will inspire not only the funders in that community, the JTIC community, but also other funders who are willing to be in practice with that or be in alignment with that. How can they activate that within their own portfolios, even if it's just a small 5% of the whole assets?
So Abdiel, we have to dig in on this just for a second, because I know there are going to be like a bunch of people listening who don't work for funders. They work on the fundraising side for, organizations that are doing that are, again, fully on board with the principles that you're talking about. And they're like, oh my gosh, that sounds amazing. We want to fund like that. We want to put the power in the hands of the community. We want to be, but we don't believe our funders are ready for that. We don't believe that funders will participate in a fund if we ask them to fully relinquish dominion and control, right? And so I would love for you to just share, how did foundations initially react? How did funders initially react when you put this in front of them and you're like, yeah, and you won't be deciding anything, you just hand over the money? Like, were you scared?
And I will say, I think this is still a journey that so many of us are on. And I'm thinking specifically around this idea of perpetuity. And I'm thinking about specifically because some of our funders are spend down foundations or spend out foundations.
Right.
Not everyone is on board even with this idea of spending down, even with their own community. So I think that's still related to this question of like how it's because it's our own healing journey as well. And we understand that, which is why we do have one-on-one coaching and consulting, because funders need to go through that reckoning themselves. As even as they do the work. So it's also a simultaneous process. And this framework, just to kind of tie it back to the framework, is not prescriptive, meaning you don't have, there's no one way to activate shifting power or shifting capital. There are many ways. And this is just the beginning of that. And I think similarly to one's own personal healing journey, there is no one way to go about it, which is why we provide this coaching and consulting. And we still have meetings every month in which we share. And that's the beautiful part about this work too, is that because we are a philanthropic serving organization, we provide a community of practice for the funders who are trying to activate it. Some are maybe less practiced in regenerative philanthropic practices, but they're part of this peer learning community that can then start to open up their vision and start to politicize and ideate how to politicize their own foundation staff, their own board. So it's all a process that we're collectively on. And I think there's still a lot of fear, and that's real. This idea of legacy, this idea of perpetuity, we're challenging those dominant assumptions, right, of philanthropy. This is a system that we inherited. How are we challenging that? It's not going to be easy, but it's worth, I think, the journey that I would say many of our funders are on and are doing such a great job of doing. So I would say, yes, I think it's scary. I think, and with all those feelings, it's so beautiful to hold the tension of all those feelings and then activate still something that is much larger than us. Because I think also we need to realize that the liberation of those that have been the most harmed by the system is the liberation for everyone. We can't have. There's a quote, and I'm trying to remember this quote, but I think it said something like, if the economy can work for Black women, it can work for all of us. So let's really think about that quote and how can we be in alignment with those that have been the most harmed. And it really is, it's about the greater picture. It's about having a future worth living in and leaving our children, our grandchildren, our pets, etc. So yes, I think it's an arduous process. One that I think is also rooted in our trauma of money, something that I've been learning on the side as well. I took a workshop on the trauma of money, and very much so, we have to work through that trauma to really understand our own barriers, prejudices against or for, moving the money in the way that we're trying to move. So it's as much as a healing journey as it is an institutional journey.
Yes, I love that. It's as much of a healing journey as it is an institutional journey. That's a good one. Okay, so moving us on a little bit, and just thinking, if you were to, give your top 1 or 2 tips to a funder professional that is listening today, regardless of their role, regardless of where their institution is at, and just 1 or 2 things that they might be able to try doing that would help move funding towards a just transition, like what would those first couple of steps be?
I want to regurgitate this idea that all the frameworks have been written already by our movement partners. So much language is available. And what I've seen oftentimes from different foundations, still even up to last year, is that they're asking movement partners to replicate the same research that they've already done internally. So for just even that first step, let's look at the frameworks that have already been authored by our movement partners. It literally tells you how to act and what to activate and when to activate it. Also, I think what's so critical about this work is that we are centering, again, our movement partners. We are in service to our movement partners. So we, in the framework, we say, listen to what your community needs. What's interesting about this particular, prompt about listen to your community is that no community looks the same, of course. But also, we're trying to dismantle the idea of scaling up. And what we're trying to activate is scaling across. And by that, there's another analogy that I want to bring to this conversation, which is rather than building a mile wide and an inch deep, let's build an inch wide and a mile deep. Let's really go into our communities. What is it that they need? Is it literal homes that they need? Is it what kind of businesses do they need to build healthy communities? But again, it's all authored by our community members. So listen to your community. What is it that they need? And how can you leverage everything that you have in your assets to support that? So those are literal 2 ways. Listen to your community, read the frameworks, and start experimenting within your own portfolio. It doesn't have to be a huge initiative. It can literally be for now, just maybe a one-time experiment, proof of concept experiment that will then activate a larger initiative in the future, right? Just be willing to experiment and be willing to take risks, because the real risk is not investing in our communities. The real risk is not investing in our own future and our own liberation. So that's the risk. It's worth actually jumping and taking the leap of faith with the hands of our community members and activating that. Look for loan funds in your community-led owned funds, community-controlled institutions in your communities. How can you support those? Because oftentimes those are the initiatives that are underfunded and then have to close shop. So how can we avoid that? How can we avoid the closing of mom and pop shops or, this localized economy? Let's look into supporting that. So, I mean, honestly, there are so many ways, even within your own grant making. What are some, even if it's discrete, ways to be less extractive? Maybe it's less reporting for your grantees. Maybe even the due diligence process. Maybe you're carrying the brunt of the work in carrying out site visits and synthesizing that information for your board. There's really different ways. And we were asking funders, let's get a little bit creative. Let's rewrite the rules. We made the rules. Let's rewrite them. There's literally, that's what I think that's what we need to realize is the rules were made for philanthropic institutions. So let's rewrite them.
And what I love about what you're suggesting as well is those mindset shifts or those questions that you can ask yourself about the way that you're going about your work or making decisions or which organizations you're working with don't necessarily, that they're not limited to folks who are in positions that are grant facing, right? Maybe you are an admin or an events coordinator and you have a decision about what organizations you're considering to cater the next board meeting, right? And just taking that moment to apply that lens to that sort of a decision. Okay, are there Black-owned, Indigenous-owned catering companies in the community that we want to actively put our dollars and our support behind, so that, again, it's not just that 5% that goes out for grant making, right? It's all the decisions that we're making as an organization that are just becoming more conscious.
Exactly. And trusting those on the ground, those frontline communities, they know what they need. I think there's been sort of this paternalistic practice in philanthropy where the foundation dictates how a community should spend their money. When in reality, I think also, which makes me think of the title of this podcast, It's Not Your Money. Let's start there. Let's start with contextualizing philanthropy and contextualizing foundations as well. Where did that come from? If we really take a close look, more often than not, there actually can be traced back to the exploitation of labor, of Black and Indigenous people, the theft of land, the land stealing of Indigenous people. So if we really think about it, it's not your money. It's not your money.
Nope.
Really stolen, accumulated wealth, and the system and the policies and everything that we've built from that point on has only allowed a specific demographic to continue to accumulate wealth off the backs of the same people that were originally stolen from. So if that would be the first action, let's take a look at where your wealth is coming from.
Yes.
Start to be to repair the harm, and let's start to work towards that.
So 100% behind that advice. Thank you so much, Abdiel. Okay, we're running out of time fast, so I want to wrap us up. I know. Time flies when you're having fun. So to wrap us up, my last question for you is just to say, if foundations, funders, shifted the way that they thought about the origin of their wealth, shifted the way that they thought about, who to partner, who to trust, who holds power, who makes decisions. If your dreams were realized for change in funding and funders took these steps, how would you paint a picture of things looking differently for communities of color?
That's a very emotional question, actually. I think it elicits this beautiful vision, and it's not rooted in just hope. It's rooted in the actual work of the people in my community, for example, as one example. Or I'm thinking about EB-PREC, East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, and their work of taking real estate off the speculative market into the hands of community members. What would that look like if we had those EB-PRECs in different parts of the country? We had affordable housing. We had a decision on how how many parks we had in our communities. We had safe schools in our in what we call inner cities, right? And kids wouldn't have to travel miles for an education. Basic human rights. Flint, Michigan would have water. You know, there are so many, just even in our own country, communities that are suffering. And if we had our own access to our own self-determination, I think so much of what we're facing right now would not exist. And I want to see that. I want everybody to have a right to a healthy community, to an education, to, again, basic human right infrastructure, to housing, to local banks, to, I just want communities to thrive. And I think in the way it's set up right now, we're honestly, we're chasing, right? We're chasing after our rent money. There's just so much harm being done even within our own communities because of the scarcity mindset that this system has created for us. Now, imagine if we were operating under this sort of thriving, abundant framework. How would that look like for all of us? Even our own internal healing. Like I said, the personal journey is just as important as the institutional journey. So I don't know if there's a concrete vision other than I want to see more EPPREX in the world. I want to see more banks rooted in Black communities, Indigenous communities, right? And this futurist, and this is really interesting, and I'll wrap it up with this, is that this is almost speculative fiction that we're doing.
Yes.
We're testing, we're piloting, we're incubating because we believe, and we are seeing this is a proof of concept. This is actually working. So how can we have more of those in different parts of the country, even the world, I would dare say. So no concrete vision, just I know it's happening and I want more of that to happen.
That is so hopeful, because I love that what you're describing is that this already exists. It's already happening. This is not trying to imagine something, that feels impossible and a million miles from where we are today. We just need more. We need to put the resources towards what is already working and getting better at recognizing that. So hopeful, so beautiful. Thank you so much, Abdiel. Just really, really appreciate everything you're bringing to your work, being here today and representing the enormous amount of dedication that I know the Justice Funders team puts into their service of community and of directing resources in a way that truly leads to a more flourishing, beautiful future for everyone.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I had a lot of fun, and sharing investment framework. Our investment framework was fun. Hopefully, if people want to reach out, they can email me or reach out to one of my colleagues.
Brilliant. Yes. And if you want to take a look at either of the frameworks, the investment or the grant making framework, please head over to justicefunders.org. You can learn all about the many things that Abdiel has mentioned today in our conversation. Highly recommend that you do that. And if you or anybody you know might be a good fit for the Capital Collaborative program by Camelback Ventures, the host of the show, the Capital Collaborative program helps white funders deepen their commitment and efforts to advancing racial equity and racial justice through their work in philanthropy and impact investing. And we, as always, are accepting applications for our next cohort. You can find out more at camelbackventures.org. That is everything we have time for today, Tia. Thank you so much, Abdiel, and thank you everybody for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again soon.